Okay, well, welcome all to the last spree seminar of the year. Today is we have the privilege of having Andy Cavanagh-Downs in giving a seminar. His experience is in the finance world, and he's had plenty of experience, 10 years of experience in Europe. And then he decided to come back to Australia, and now is the executive director of Embark. He'll tell us a little bit more about the organization. And so basically, if you want to welcome him, he'll take over, and feel free to start a conversation with him. This is what he wants. He wants involvement. So let's welcome Andy.
Thanks, Ivan. Thanks very much for having me here today. I guess today we're going to be, or I'll be talking about more the application and how you can involve people and community in renewable energy. It's probably a less technical topic than what you normally cover, but certainly, some of the challenges are as difficult or large as what you probably deal with in a lab or in a more technical setting. As Ivan said, I'm the executive director of Embark. Embark is a charity. It's a not-for-profit organisation with DGR status. Our focus is on assisting communities participate in renewable energy projects. And I'll talk through how we go about that today and set out what some of our focus is in that respect. The first thing I'm going to do, though, is show some images on the slides. And what I want you to do, I'm not sure how much you've followed what's been going on in the world of wind development in Australia, but if you read some of the articles in the press, you'd have a sense that there's this huge fear of wind farms and wind turbines, and there's a lot of unscientifically proven health claims about the impact of living near turbines. So what I'm going to do is show you some images to contrast those kind of reports in the media versus what went on in Australia's first community-owned wind farm, which is called Hepburn Wind. Okay. So if you think about again those health claims in contrast with what you see on the screen, this is Hepburn Wind's launch. Hepburn Wind is a 4.1 megawatt wind farm just outside Daylesford in Victoria. It has 2 turbines. The amount of power generated roughly covers the power needs of the local of the town. What happened was the history of this project is quite interesting in that originally a developer came to town and looked to set up a project, and some people reacted very badly to that and basically chased the proponents out of town. One of the people that went along to that first meeting for community engagement was a guy that grew up in Denmark, and Denmark has quite an interesting history in terms of wind development and community participation in those projects. He didn't like what he saw was the reaction to the proposed wind farm, so he basically went out on the local street. There's a market in the town on a regular basis, and he set up a card stand there and basically set out a really rough approximation of what you would do in terms of developing your own community-owned wind farm. Set it out with a diagram as to how the different flows would happen, from investment to power generation to returns to investors and things like that. And from there, that kind of concept grew and eventually became what is now Hepburn Wind. So what you can see there is, this was something that's overwhelmingly embraced by the local community. It doesn't have 100% acceptance within the community. I'm not sure you'll ever get 100% acceptance for any kind of infrastructure development or any kind of change process within a community. But the number of objectors is literally a handful now. And generally speaking, it's brought a lot of investment, interest, visitors, tourism, and stimulation to the local economy. It's really been an interesting way to stimulate local activity. There's more than just sort of renewable energy that comes along with a project like this. What you see is that by involving local community, you also get a skills development. So in the picture that you can see there is a combination of the present and former directors of Hepburn Wind. As people go through creating their own project, there is a lot of learning that occurs. No one person ever has all the knowledge or skills to complete one of these things. I know I'm doing one at the moment, a solar project in Sydney, and I've certainly learnt a lot in the last 12 months as we're getting close to financial close on that project. So you do see a tremendous amount of knowledge being acquired that enriches the community again, and those skills can then be used elsewhere for other purposes beyond just renewable energy too. And that kind of development shouldn't be underestimated. It's also a useful way to educate people. This is a local school visit to one of the turbines. It's an interesting way for kids, school, to have a practical demonstration of what it means to generate renewable energy. In this case through a wind turbine, but obviously the application could equally be done through a solar PV project as well. And one of the things that Hepburn Wind's particularly proud of is the community fund that they've established. The objective is to create over $1 million of donations from the 2 turbine project over the project life. For a small rural town, that's a huge stimulus. What you can see there is the committee that is responsible for choosing appropriate projects to fund. And the guy just to the left of centre with the crutches, he's actually the landowner where the turbines are sited. So he's someone that can see not only the benefit from the power being generated, but also the way that these grants are being cycled within the community for worthy projects. Those projects go beyond energy as well. They're for the sports teams, for local environmental causes, for all kinds of things. So, it's great to see an enrichment and social benefits flowing from a renewable energy project as well. One of the things that Hepburn Wind chose to do was paint a mural on one of the turbines. Again, it's just a way to create local character for the local shire. You can see that these turbines are starting to form part of the narrative of the local area. Daylesford does have quite a substantial tourism industry. Anything that kind of adds to that fabric, I think, is good for the local community. And you can start to see that the local shire is identifying a lot with this project. That's something that they're proud of, and it's a highly visible and unique aspect of the community. So they're just some more images of the completed mural there. So what I'll talk about now is a bit how Embark looks to involve or recommend that communities become involved in renewable energy projects, and what we think is a sensible approach to take. We very much look for communities to use proven technology. There's quite a bit of innovation in the community participation in its own right, and it's very difficult to innovate in more than one area, as you can probably appreciate. So where you're raising capital from local investors, we think that there's a responsibility to make sure that you can deliver on your financial objectives along with the environmental and social outcomes as well. Where you're using unproven technology, the ability for an unsophisticated investor to assess that risk is probably limited. So we'd recommend using proven technologies like wind turbines or solar PV, okay? I can explain that in more detail if people want, but perhaps we can go through that a little bit later. And I guess part of the reason that I'll set that out is that a lot of people will probably be attracted to investing in this kind of project because it is local and it is community. And so we feel that people should have an even higher level of care or a sense of duty to make those financial returns relative to, potentially another offering, okay? So, you really do have a high level of care because people will invest with you because of your identity. So as I said, we focus mainly on using proven technology, which is mainly wind turbines and solar PV. Obviously, things like water-related technology could also be in there, but generally speaking, the broadest application is wind and solar.
The question on that:
Sure.
Have you contemplated biomass projects?
We have done, but again, just looking for a good business case that's easy to apply. We haven't come across too many in our field yet, but it certainly, I do know of one that's being explored, I think more in the Blue Mountains area, but I personally haven't had a lot of experience with those yet. Okay, but it's something we'd be very much interested in checking.
Do you liaise at all with, rural Australia is full of co-ops, right? Sort of all of the
Sure.
farmers co-ops, dairy co-ops, and so on. Are you engaging with them?
We to a limited extent so far. We don't have extensive resources, so how we apply them, we're very careful. So far we've been focused, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, on proving a solar PV community project. That's been a focus because we see that that's got really broad application. We've also continued to support some wind projects, and really during the course of next year we'll be looking for where to turn the attention, I guess. So I'll come on to that in a minute. So the things that you need to consider, or community groups need to consider for wind projects versus solar PV projects are a bit different. The drivers are a little bit different, and I'll just touch on at a high level what those different considerations are. The need for early stage capital is quite acute for developing a community wind project. The technical studies that need to be conducted to prove a site in terms of wind resource and access to the grid are quite substantial. This barrier is actually quite hard for community groups to address, because when they come together they tend to just be a group of people with a desire to do something, and they don't have a balance sheet. So if you look at a commercial wind developer, if it's a really big company like AGL or even a Wind Lab or something like that, they've got a balance sheet and an existing skills base that they can draw upon to identify sites, do the relevant pre-feasibility studies to get a high level understanding of what the wind resource is like at a site, so on and so forth. Where a community group comes together, it's just people with a common cause, a common goal, and they don't really have a balance sheet that they can either pay for or conduct studies themselves, nor can they invest in, say, a monitoring mast necessarily without raising capital. The ability to raise capital for that kind of group is difficult because they're just a group of people at that point. So it really does need quite a lot of organisation. It needs a really clear, concise story. It needs to have a kind of a rough idea that a site is viable. And depending on which jurisdiction you're in, that can be difficult. So for example, in Victoria at the moment with the setback rules, having a 2-kilometre buffer from a residence means that the ability to gain that certitude is very, very difficult to obtain. Where community wind projects tend to really drive forward is where they've got a paid dedicated staff member, so that's someone that can drive these things forward. It may be just on a part-time basis, but it really does make a big difference because there is a lot to drive forward, there is a lot to keep on top of, and you are coordinating with a number of different counterparties at any given time, whether that be for grid connection, proving the wind resource, dealing with landowners and near neighbours and as well, I guess, building interest and getting some momentum for the project. So access to technical assistance is vital because it's very difficult to, it's unlikely that a community group in a rural location will have access to all of those skills on a voluntary basis from the outset. So you're going to have to probably have some sort of funding to pay for studies at the right way, at the right time, and also know who to deal with in terms of counterparties like distribution networks or transmission networks and so on and so forth. In terms of solar PV, to some extent it's actually a little bit easier, I would say, because the application of the technology is more straightforward, because the feasibility studies are, I guess, less onerous. It's actually more easy to identify a viable site and understand how you could apply proven technology and what kind of, I guess, power output you could generate on an ongoing basis. The key here is to basically create your own feed-in tariff. That, ACT aside, I don't think there'll be feed-in tariffs anywhere in Australia anytime soon. So the best thing you can do is basically create the equivalent for yourself, which is probably dealing with a site that has pretty substantial power needs. So identifying something like a business, a government-related institution, or some sort of location that has a really consistent base load demand profile on an ongoing basis during daylight hours, obviously. So what we recommend there is what we're piloting at the moment is installing solar PV on a rooftop, selling all the output to the occupier of that building. They consume that power effectively first. For any excess power needs, they draw down from the grid as per any other retail customer.
Andy, would you need a retailer license then to undertake such a...
What you need to look for is a retail exemption, actually. So because it's sort of a small one-off arrangement, what you look for is a retail exemption. And that's something that we're just going through at the moment. Okay. But yeah, you want to avoid being a retailer as well, because you don't have the administrative depth, let's say, to cover those obligations. Okay.
Opens up a whole new area.
Yeah. No, and the key in all these things is keeping things as simple as possible. There's a lot of work anyway, trust me. There's a lot to do. Even on a community solar project, keeping the entity that you use running, you're having billing arrangements, there's maintenance, cleaning, all those kind of things. It's interesting work to do, especially if you're passionate about the field. But the key thing to do is to keep the administrative burden as low as possible. Yes.
If there's a good business case for putting solar photovoltaics on a commercial building, for example,
Yep.
Why would that business not invest in that themselves rather than seeking community investment? Is it a lack of access to capital or something? Sure,
it's a really good question. The answer, there's a few different answers to that, I would say. One is, we would encourage anyone to, install more in renewable energy infrastructure. Our conversation with one water treatment facility resulted in them wanting to do it themselves in the end, and for us that's fine. That's a good outcome, at the end of the day. Why would you do it yourself? Why would you use community instead of doing it yourself or using a commercial arrangement with another counterparty? You could do it yourself. You may have limited access to capital, in which case, this is basically quite an efficient and affordable way to access capital. Depending on the entity that you're dealing with, often it's an innovative way to engage with either a customer base or your local area, okay? So, for example, if you're running a shopping centre, for me that would be a good way to build up foot traffic for the shopping centre. You could put a solar community project on your rooftop. Basically, people no longer are customers, they become co-owners in the infrastructure. A co-owner in the infrastructure will have a higher level of care and interest and emotional attachment to the location than just a regular customer. So for me, it's an interesting way to engage with a customer base, or to access people that you otherwise may neglect. The same applies to sports centres. Rather than paying an ongoing, an annual fee to use a swimming centre or a basketball court, you could look at doing something like this instead. So instead of getting a return, maybe you get a ongoing, ongoing access to the facilities, let's say. So there's ways that we work with counterparties to structure the offering so it makes sense to their customer base or the base that they're trying to engage with. Okay? Does that answer your question? Yep. And then one of the things we really strongly recommend is to thoroughly do the organisation planning and the business planning, and make sure there's a strong cost focus on post-installation, particularly in relation to the administration and the governance of the organisation. It's very easy to get excited about building something. What's probably less exciting is thinking about year 8 when you're kind of doing the books and submitting your BAS and all that kind of thing. But you need to make sure you're planning for that and you're budgeting for services for that kind of thing, because if you do things the way that we recommend, you're going to have an ongoing reporting obligation. You're going to have obligations to your investors. So you're going to have to make sure that you're on top of your accounting and all kinds of correspondence and banking with those with your investors. We do have governance templates that we share with people to make it easier for them, and certainly within advances in things like bookkeeping software, this kind of administration and upkeep of an organisation is getting easier all the time, which is good news. Okay. So I've already sort of run through what Embark is. We're focused on assisting communities participate in renewable energy. I think one thing I forgot to say is why do we think that's important? We think it's important because in any change process, you really need to engage with people and make sure that they have buy-in and support for that change. You really do need to create social license for that transition. We think that a useful way to do that is to involve people in those projects, whether that be in a financial sense, but also in a planning sense, and hopefully in an ownership sense as well. Where people are co-owners or have some sort of shared interest in a project, they're much more likely to advocate for that change or make that change easy to happen, I would say. So really what we're about is creating social license and creating more stakeholders for the move towards renewable energy as we change from, I guess, a carbon-based economy. Okay. So in terms of what we try to help with, we look to provide project planning for community groups. We help them map out what is a sensible way to go about that process. We've created financial models for wind and solar projects, which we're happy to share with community groups. And what that does is help them test their assumptions and make sure what they're proposing makes sense from a financial perspective as well, because you don't want to let people down if you're raising money from local investors. We've worked on legal templates, for example, with Baker and McKenzie in terms of some solar projects, and we're in a position to share some of those templates with other community groups. And we've spent a lot of time working on governance frameworks and templates to assist community boards set up how they would structure their organisation and make it easier for them to map out how they'll operate such an entity on an ongoing basis. So again, there's quite a lot of work that you need to do. what we try to do is make it cheaper and easier for community groups to set up projects and make sure they're maintained on an ongoing basis. Okay? So that covers what I was going to talk about. Are there other questions that... Yep.
You mentioned there's a need for startup funds.
Yeah.
Where do community groups normally get that?
I guess different places where we're looking to... Embark itself tries to organise some early funding for projects that have a viable business case. So that's something that we try to do. Likewise, the people that have come together, the proponents for the project, often have contacts or access to capital, and they may look to arrange that themselves. So they're the likely sources, if you like, the existing network of people that are coming together to build the project, or potentially that's something that we look to assist community groups with, is get access to philanthropists or potentially debt capital to get them from sort of the idea phase into generation. Okay. Yep.
Could you expand a little bit more on, you said that there's a solar project, community project going on here in Sydney. Can you tell us a little bit more about it? What are the hurdles? How is it being set up so that things work out in the future? Can you give us...
Sure. So we are in the final stages of, we're getting to financial close on that project. So we're waiting till we get to that point till we talk about it publicly. But the concept is that we're going to install around 400 kilowatts of solar PV. That will be financed by a community-owned company. We're using an unlisted public company as the structure because we think that that's an efficient way to maintain the entity over time. It's easy to get access to legal and tax advice for that kind of entity because most people are used to dealing with that versus, say, a co-op, which in a city, in an urban location, people are less used to dealing with cooperatives, let's say. So that entity will finance the investment of the solar PV, and over time, that entity will receive a return or payment based on the output of the solar PV over a project life at a pre-agreed price schedule. We've mapped that out over the contract life, which is 25 years, and there's sort of contracts in place for maintenance and cleaning and things like that. So we've really looked to map out the entire life of the project in a contractual base from the outset. What we'll be doing is offering shares to the general public probably in 2015 because the project itself is sited on a redevelopment which will be completed, expected to be in 2016. So we're just staggering the offer to the general public at a sensible time ahead of the project installation. What that does is it creates a model in terms of the company formation, the constitution, aspects of the power sale, let's say, maintenance, registration, exemptions for retail exemptions, all those kind of things. It creates pilots and templates and a framework, if you like, that other people can access and learn from and make it easier and cheaper for them to do their own project, if you like. So what we're looking for that to be is a pilot for how to apply community solar PV. And we have several other sites that we're working with community groups on now to do the second and third iterations of that project as well. So we're looking for that to be, a really strong pilot that other people can copy. Okay.
How did you deal with how you're going to connect this amount of electricity to the grid? Was there not?
Sure. Again, just coming back to the key element of the business case, you're looking to scale the amount of the installation based on the base requirements of the site. Okay. So at this stage for a community solar PV project, that's what's feasible. So you pick a site that has a really high base load. You what we recommend is that you then invest in any energy efficiency to reduce that base load as much as you can, and then you scale the PV to the amount of that base load. Okay, so what you look for is high usage sites. So it could be something like a hospital, a data center, you know, a university. Those kind of locations that have got really substantial ongoing power needs during daylight hours, 365 days a year. Okay, because what you're looking for is you're indifferent to whether it's a Sunday, a Monday, a Thursday, a public holiday, a regular working day, whatever the case may be. You just want to sell all the power from that installation to the site that you're basing that on. Later on, as I guess the project costs come down further, increasingly you'll be able to tolerate some export to the grid. But at this stage, we're looking to scale things to the base requirements. Okay.
So it is ensured that if by any chance you're not consuming the electricity there,
yep,
you cannot export it into the grid?
It depends on the connection agreement you have and everything, and also the contractual agreements you have. What we're doing is we're contracting the entire output on the pilot project, the entire output to the counterparty. So, for example, this is scaled conservatively for that reason, but theoretically, if you were to export 1 kilowatt of 1 kilowatt hour of solar power, in this case, the community company doesn't mind. They're selling all the output to the counterparty in the transaction. Okay, so depending on how you contract, you may have a tolerance to export some power to the grid. Or you may just say, I'm going to sell all of the power to you. If ultimately you export some of it, or if some of it in effect goes back into the grid, it's not my issue. It just depends how you set things up. You tend to look at that on a case-by-case basis. Okay.
Yep. Then all that the PV does in terms of the network service provider is present a reduced load with no chance of export or anything like that. Just how does that change the nature of your connection agreement negotiation with them? Do you have to negotiate with them at all, or is it just easier?
Yeah, my understanding is you have to get approval. I think it's depending on where you site, obviously where you site it, things may or may not be easy. Certainly where we're looking, the load demand in aggregate is far in excess of generation in the area, let's say. So I don't expect that there shouldn't be any problem there.
But there's an interesting disconnect, isn't there? If you do a big energy efficiency retrofit on a big site, you can get 400 kilowatts of savings, for a large site. You don't need to negotiate with a network service provider regarding that, do you?
No. I mean, that's network access, negotiation, all that area is very complex, as you well know. I don't think I'm in a position to comment as an authority on it. We basically just follow the existing process, and hopefully people can learn from that experience as well as we go through things. I think it's important to have visible examples so that people can understand it. And one of the benefits of these kind of projects is that you do talk about them publicly. So where a private installer may just go through it themselves, learn something, and then that's it. They're not really in a position to, or nor do they have an incentive to share that information. I think what we'll see is that the connection processes for these kind of projects will be very valuable in terms of shared learnings for people that are interested in that part of the market.
No, I think I totally agree. Some actual transparency on what these processes are costing parties would be very useful. Yeah.
I mean, Hepburn Wind's experience in that field is interesting. I won't go into the detail here, but it's particularly for wind projects, especially for wind projects. Connection is a big factor, and you really need to be on top of it. And it's very, very hard to budget for because you don't have a lot of control or transparency as to what the ultimate cost will be. it's much, much harder on winds, we expect, than the majority of solar cases that we envisage. Okay. Yep.
Thanks very much, Andy. Do the models and the documentation and the systems you set up, do they transfer across state borders very easily? Is part A of my question. Part B is how sensitive is the model to changing regulatory structures that change with time, let alone across borders?
In terms of solar PV or wind?
I guess PV was in my mind, but the question...
Okay, so in terms of... I'll start off on wind in terms of going between states. The planning regimes between states do vary, and it does have a big impact, is the short answer on wind. And the obvious example is Victoria in terms of the 2 kilometre setback rules. So that makes it very, very difficult to plan a wind project and to get approval. It's also not clear, from my perspective at least, as a layman, at what point does that setback provision extinguish. So for example, if no one objects for a period of time, but then they do so very late in a process, at what point does that right disappear? And there may be there may very well be a clear line in the sand in that respect. I'm just not aware of what it is. So from a wind perspective, yes, differences between states can be significant. For solar PV, we haven't gone through it all in a lot of detail. To some extent, you may be looking at network areas anyway as being a bigger driver, potentially. Expect some difference, but not as material as wind, I would say. And sorry, the second question
was about changing rules and attitudes in the future. Because the situation at the moment with high, low price for feeding in and a high price for buying back.
Yeah, they're just enormous drivers as to what is and isn't viable. So where you are getting 8 cents, for example, 8 cents a kilowatt hour for feeding solar PV generated electricity into the grid versus what you really need to earn is a big driver. So your tolerance for export is very low. It means that you effectively become extremely conservative in your planning and budgeting, and your tolerance for things like export is virtually nil. That kind of regulatory impact is huge, I would say. If you change just some very small elements in that respect, you could have an enormous impact, not only in the take-up of community-backed projects, but just, commercial installations or residential installations.
In your model, that the rules change and then...
Well, it depends. If you're just contracting behind the meter and below the load, then your exposure in terms of regulations are diminished, I would say. You always are going to have some risk if you do anything, but the potential exposure is diminished. If you do have some amount of export, which again we don't necessarily recommend at this stage, then yes, you're going to have more regulatory exposure, and you do need to budget for that. Any kind of risk like that, you probably want to make sure you've got some headroom and margin in there in case you do have a drift over time. Because what we have seen is an absence of consistency, let's say, in terms of the rules. So you would be sensible, if you do have any kind of regulatory exposure, to budget for some amount of change.
Are you generating LGCs and contracting for that as well?
So if you're above the threshold, then yes, you're generating LGCs. That does become an important part of the business model. You do need, at this stage in terms of the business case, I believe you do need to earn revenue from the sale of LGCs. One thing that we're looking at is helping community groups market those at a premium to either a customer base in terms of the counterparty where you're hosting, or the potentially, for example, the investors in the project. So rather than buying 100% green power from your retailer, you may just buy LGCs from your own community project, at a comparable rate. So, it's just a more direct route, if you like, to your own offsets. So yeah, LGCs are important, and likewise, if you were to have a very small site for solar PV, then you'd look at STCs. Yes?
Where does Embark's funding come from, and what do you see as the main barriers or limitations to doing lots more community projects like this?
Okay. Should I be repeating the questions as well? Will that? In terms of Embark's funding, we mainly rely on private philanthropy for support. So, people make donations to us like they do another charity. So they're always welcome if you'd like to donate. We also, from time to time, do some selected consulting work for some counterparties, and we also apply for government grants in some instances. But mainly we rely on private philanthropy. So that's a key thing for our budget. And sorry, I keep forgetting the second question that everyone asked.
What do you see as, it sounds like amazing work that you're doing and really important. What do you see as the main barriers to scaling that up and doing many, many more projects?
Yeah, for me, the key thing, I guess I've got a business background, so, someone with a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? So I'd say for me, the key issue is creating viable business cases, okay? So you have solar PV panels that have been working for years. It's proven technology. You can get it off the shelf. You've got a range of installers. You've got lots of competition. Likewise with wind turbines, you can get several different makers. You can get lots of different engineers to give you advice in terms of the resource, so on and so forth. So there's lots of proven technology out there. It's about applying it in a way that makes sense for the consumer of your product, the electricity, or the LGCs. And likewise, it makes sense for the investor in the project or your capital providers, whether that be debt or equity. So for me, that's the key driver here. And what you have to do is you have to manage this organisation that you create as well as a private venture, potentially even better than a private venture, because you're probably going to have a mix of objectives. You're going to have a financial objective in terms of returns. You've also got your environmental return, and often people like to see some sort of social outcome as well. So one of the things, because there's not a huge amount of margin in these projects, what we're doing on the solar project, rather than create a community fund that there's a commitment to provide a contribution to, we're going to basically give investors the option every year to donate part of their return to a given cause for the year. So that's going to create social outcomes. So what that'll look like is you'll receive an update of the outcome for the year. It'll have 3 boxes. You can tick, I want to receive my capital return and dividend for the year. I want to receive my capital return but donate my dividend to the cause for the year. Or I want to donate my capital and dividend for the year. And then, so the board will select a project. It might be putting panels on the local school, or it might be creating a public artwork, or it might be getting a new wheelchair for the local nursing home or something like that. Whatever that board thinks is a worthwhile project within the community for that year, that'll be set forward as the community project for the year. And then investors will be given the opportunity to contribute that based on their means, if you like, if you understand what I mean. So, what that means, we're basically trying to design things so that these kind of entities can compete with private enterprise or public initiatives, but along with, the standard outcomes in terms of a private business, the financial outcomes, we're also trying to make sure that there are these social outcomes that come with projects as well. But I guess in terms of ranking, I very much look to make sure people make their financial objectives, and then that in a way can cascade into the social outcomes as well. It's very easy to spend money provided you've made it. If you don't make it, it's very hard to create the social outcomes off the back of things. Yes?
Andy, what kind of financial return or dividend return do you typically provide to investors for such projects? What are they looking for?
Yep. So for the pilot solar project, we're targeting a 5% return for investors. I'd say that's fair and modest in the circumstances. It's not excessive. It is, it is a pilot project. It's hard. There are expenses and things that you're going to wear in a first project that make it more difficult. What we are looking to do, I guess that's the financial return that we're looking to create. And as we say, we're looking to create the environmental and social outcomes as well. So what we're looking there is people to, I guess, ascribe a value in all three senses of the return. And we think that 5% is a realistic and deliverable target in that pilot project. And that's something that we're really focused on delivering. It may be the case that other projects subsequently can make a superior return, and that's something that we're looking to achieve, is to make them more and more viable over time.
And then on the other side of the equation, of course, is the sale price, the counterparty. Are you looking at the counterparty's current purchase price, or are you looking to sell energy because it's green at a higher price or lower price? Yeah, I mean, when we look at sites, we look at their existing billing in detail. For the pilot project, it's a greenfield, so they don't have existing bills. We set out a power purchase schedule that they found was attractive, and in their opinion, they felt that it was going to save them money over the contract life. When we look at existing sites, we spend a lot of time with them on their existing billing. I actually had some conversations here last week with some of your colleagues about that. What we tend to find is that you start to have to educate the business owner on the billing structure that they have, because people tend not to look at it in detail. So, people tend to say, I'm paying, 28 cents a kilowatt hour, and they don't necessarily understand the breakdown of how that's split up between network charges, generation charges, transmission charges, and other, ancillary charges. What we do tend to see is that the network charges for commercial bills are a very, very, very significant part of the bill, and we may or may not be able to affect some or all of that charge depending on the network area and how the bill is configured. So it's quite frustrating because there isn't a very simple answer. It changes for different customers, depends on the retail arrangements they have and also the network area they're in. Okay.
Just on that, I think, and it circles back to what I think Richard was raising about sort of risk and regulatory risk. Your typical network determinations, 2 or 3 years ahead, you're trying to, you're having customers signing up for, 20 years of PV or something like that. And certainly there's some discussion about transitioning these network tariffs so they're more about peak demand and less about usage. With pretty significant potential implications for the value of the PV to the end user, isn't it?
Yeah, and one of the things I'll point out there is where the bill does set out when the network peak is, in the instances that I've looked at, invariably they're in daylight hours. It's obviously not going to be the case for everybody. However, if you were generating PV electricity on your roof, you would have an impact in most instances on those peaks if it was during the middle of the day, for example. So you would have an impact. Where the bill drives an instance which creates a charge based on the peak, it's very hard to ascribe a value in terms of the savings, in terms of an offset from a rooftop installation, for example. So it's hard to attribute value to that. Where you're offsetting generation, it's very clear cut. You used to consume, 10 kilowatt hours. After the PV installation, you're using 8 kilowatt hours. On average, you can say there's whatever you generate is the saving in effect. Where it comes to demand peak charges, it's harder to ascribe a savings value, but in most instances you would probably, or in a lot of instances, you could affect it. it makes it hard to show a potential customer value, and it's something that we are very conservative on, and we try not to. We don't make claims about a huge saving in that respect because we can't verify it. Okay.
Just as one extension on that, that's the network contract, but what about network tariff? What about the retailers? Generally, they've only got, 2, 3, 4 year offerings as well, or do you tend to see longer offerings available, which helps the customer manage risk better with you guys? Or?
It depends what the business has negotiated and who they've dealt with. I mean, there's consultants that just shop around and give advice to businesses to get the best deal. That may involve locking into a contract for 2 years. You may have people that have been on an existing arrangement for 20 years, kind of thing. It really the spectrum of billing structures is large. So there's no one answer to network or retail or contract term or anything like that. It really we look at it in every instance, basically. At the back there.
Andy, I have a question regarding the decision structures in the public company you mentioned for the solar plotting. You mentioned that cooperatives are probably a bit more difficult to set up. So, but obviously the advantage of the cooperative model is one man, one vote. So how is it kind of translated into the company structure you are setting up, and what is the distinct community?
Sure. Sorry, if I said it's more difficult to set up a co-op, sorry, I didn't mean that. I wouldn't say that it's necessarily more difficult to set up a co-op. That wasn't my intention. What we're doing on the pilot PV project is actually, for those that aren't aware, with a cooperative, a key distinction in terms of the governance structure is that a member of the co-op has a vote. It doesn't matter how many shares in the cooperative you have, each shareholder or each member has one vote. Whereas typically with a corporate structure, voting is based on the percentage of shareholding, okay? What we did for the pilot PV project was actually amend the constitution to reflect the democratic nature of a cooperative approach. So we have one shareholder, one vote. One thing that I would sort of point out though is have a think about access to capital, particularly if you need some sort of underwriting or bridge financing early on. If you're looking to get someone to underwrite the deal, they will want a lot of control in that underwriting period. That will be undermined, that control will be undermined if they have one vote in that process. It may actually limit your ability to access capital at that point in time. As far as I'm aware, you've got to, you need to be practical about these things as well. We're going to offer shares in the pilot project to there'll be 400 shares and there'll be 400 initial shareholders. The chances of anyone actually ever acquiring a controlling stake in the company is very remote and unlikely to come about. I don't see the spirit of what you're doing. You're not really going to be attracting corporate raiders or carpet baggers or anything like that. I mean, we're not talking about, hundreds of millions of dollars here. So I think the chances of having people do, what's the way to express it? The chances of unsavoury activity happening through shareholder voting are pretty remote anyway. I personally wouldn't be worried too much about that structure. I think you're going to have a pretty democratic approach from most investors, whether it's a co-op or a company in a conventional sense. In any event, if it is a key driver for you, you can change the constitution of a company to reflect a democratic voting structure, in which case, as far as I'm aware, there is no practical difference between a co-op and a company. What I would say is that you're more likely to access either reduced rate or pro bono skills for a company because there's more lawyers, accountants, tax advisors and so on and so forth that know how to deal with company structures relative to co-op structures. Okay?
We have time for one more question.
Did you have one more question? You're up.
Just how long does it normally take one of these projects from woe to go?
27 years. It depends how long you want to set it up for and the approach you want to take. One thing I would say is that I guess we're doing a pilot solar PV equity model whereby you raise equity for the investment. I think one of the next things we're going to do is look at a debt financing structure which will potentially have a shorter term and also, maybe address some things like a more efficient way to approach insurance and maintenance and access to the solar PV as well.
So I meant more from the project being just an idea to actually being constructed and operating.
Okay, so commencement of generation. I think you're probably looking at 12 to 18 months at least, because you've got to come together as a group, set out what you're going to do. The key thing I think community groups need to focus on, and if you do want to do this, I'd really, really emphasise this, is you've got to focus on someone who wants to buy the power. The rest of it's pretty easy. You can copy a lot of stuff from us, okay? We can help you with models, templates, all that kind of thing. And trust me, there's enough work to do so that, if you want to create something or you're worried that you're not going to make something unique, trust me, you're going to do it anyway. But try to leverage as much of the work that we've done. And really what you want to focus on is customers to buy the power. That can take, one conversation. It might take, 6 months, 10 months of looking. It depends how successful you are and what kind of network you've got and, the doors you can open and the conversations you can have. But that's the key part, is to get the counterparty to buy the power. That's where there's no hard and fast answer to how long this will take. But I'd expect that you're probably going to spend at least 18 months from getting together with an idea or having a first conversation with an idea to, best case is 18 months generation. Okay. Great. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks again, Andy, for this great presentation.
Thank you.